Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the KDI School World Bank monthly webinar series. My name is Yeonji Kim, and I'll be your MC today. Before we get started, please note that today's webinar will be recorded for knowledge sharing purposes. This webinar is a joint program with the World Bank. In each session, experts from the bank share their latest findings with the KDI School community. We hope you'll gain exclusive insights into the cutting-edge research and also take a moment to reflect on how it can be applied. If you have any questions or comments, please wait for the Q&A session or leave your messages in the chat. Today's webinar topic is health taxes. Now I'm pleased to introduce today's distinguished speakers, Ms. Ceren Ozer and Dr. Evan Blecher. Ms. Ozer was our originally announced speaker, and we are delighted to have Dr. Blecher joining us today. Let me briefly introduce both of them. First, Ms. Ceren Ozer is a senior economist at the World Bank, specializing in tax capacity development and the intersection of taxation and sustainable development. She manages the World Bank's Global Tax Program and the Secretariat of the Platform for Collaboration on Tax. Her technical work focuses on excise tax design and administration and fiscal policy's role in women's economic empowerment. Previously, she led efforts to integrate political economy insights into developmental reform strategies and project implementation across multiple regions. She began her career at the Center for Global Development, co-authoring A Better Globalization, Legitimacy, Governance, and Reform. And Dr. Evan Blecher is an economist in the Global Tax Program at the World Bank, supporting countries in reforming and raising health taxes with a focus on policy design, implementation, and evaluation. He is also an honorary professor at the University of Cape Town. Prior to joining the bank, he worked at the World Health Organization and held research and policy roles at the University of Illinois at Chicago and the American Cancer Society. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Cape Town and MA economics from the University of the West of England, Bristol, and a bachelor's degree from the University of Cape Town. Everyone, please warmly welcome Ms. Ozer and Dr. Blecher.
Thank you so much for this warm welcome, and it's an absolute pleasure to be with KDI School community today. Evan and I will be talking about a topic that is very exciting to us, and I hope at the end of this presentation you will share our excitement and enthusiasm for this. And the topic is tax policies for health. We will try to give you a comprehensive global perspective with a lot of country examples. And when we say tax policies for health, we're talking about predominantly excise taxes on tobacco, alcohol, and sugar-sweetened beverages. And throughout this presentation, we hope that the logic or the rationale behind it will become very clear. Let's go to the next slide. I think it's very familiar to us, maybe not the exact statistics, but the idea that the negative health impact of these products are huge. So for instance, tobacco is estimated, tobacco use, smoking, kills up to half of the continuing users, costs them somewhere around 10 years of life on average. But not only it causes harm to the people who consume this product, it also affects people around the users. So for instance, 20% of deaths are estimated to occur in non-smokers through exposure to secondhand smoke. And in wide range of countries, we know that causes anywhere between 15 to over 30% of all cancers, not just lung and throat cancer, is due to tobacco consumption. In fact, on the right-hand side of the slide, what you're seeing is a distribution of tobacco-related deaths in the United States, which gives you a sense of significance of other cancers that are caused and other very important diseases that are caused by the consumption of this product. Alcohol similarly causes a wide range of diseases and injuries, and we're all familiar that it also has some other very negative consequences when it's abused, such as maternal, prenatal, and nutritional conditions that affect the human capital of mothers, children, but also cause a lot of non-communicable diseases such as cancer, diabetes, alcohol use disorders, cardiovascular, and other diseases. In the recent years, there has also been significant attention with the rising epidemic of obesity and related cardiovascular diseases on sugar-sweetened beverages. And in addition to overweight and obesity, that's often linked to heavy sugar-sweetened beverage use, which we sometimes use the acronym SSB for this. We can also see that it causes other important issues like dental caries in children. And again, on the right-hand side of the slide, just to give you a sense of the deaths and disability adjusted life years impact of the consumption of these products. Next slide, please. Why do we care about this as the World Bank? Because what we know is that these have had serious negative health implications in high-income countries, but now we see a lot of the negative impact on the economy, on the human capital, is playing out in low and low middle income countries. So mortality and morbidity due to diets high in SSB consumption are rising exponentially in low middle income countries. That's what you see with the green line on the right-hand side of this slide. And rate of disease adjusted the rate of the diseases is also can be seen in the numbers on the left-hand side. So what I want to distinguish on this chart is that the dotted lines are for high-income countries. The blue line is tobacco, yellow line is alcohol, green line is sugar-sweetened beverages, and then the blue direct lines, yellow line and the green line is for low middle income countries. And you can see that this issue is becoming much more significant for low middle income countries in terms of the growth and the impact. As countries get richer, we also know that the economic cost of people getting sick and people getting disability due to the consumption of these products cause a higher healthcare expenses. Some of our colleagues have done some really interesting work. For instance, economic cost of smoking has risen from 1.2% of GDP in low-income countries. This was estimated, of course, to 2.2% of GDP. Sorry, in the high-income countries, it's 2.2% of the GDP. So when low and low middle-income countries go up the income chain as they grow, their expected economic costs from smoking are expected to rise. Another good example comes from China, and this is research done by the Tobacco Atlas. Economic cost of smoking has increased by fourfold between 2000 and 2008, and it's a very significant number. Next slide, please. To really illustrate these concepts, we want to give you a country example, and Evan Blecher, who has actually worked and supported Cambodian counterparts in reforming their excise taxes, will walk us through and make this this concept a little bit more practical for you. Over to you, Evan.
Thanks, Ceren. I think Cambodia is a fantastic example for a country that's seeing an economic transition. A generation ago, it was a low-income country. It's now becoming a middle-income country, and they have ambitions of even becoming an upper middle-income country within the next decade. And what we see within this transition as countries move from being a low-income country to a middle-income country is that the profile of illness and disease changes. And what we see, particularly within low-income countries, is a very high burden of infectious diseases, but also we see a very high burden of death and disability that results from exposures and occupational risks, unsafe water and sanitation, air pollution, etc. And what happens is, as we see this transition of them becoming middle-income countries, we see the non-communicable diseases rising in terms of the contribution to overall death and disability. And Cambodia is a great example of this, where we see, for example, in a 30-year period, we saw, for example, tobacco and alcohol use increase in terms of the contribution to total DALYs, even though DALYs were potentially declining from these countries. And this highlights really the sort of economic transition within the health space and how it affects the health space. And as the previous slide mentioned, so as the countries develop, so the cost of these treating illnesses, the cost of productivity losses increase dramatically as countries get richer. And ultimately, what we know is tobacco and alcohol are two of the largest contributors to non-communicable diseases, and sugary drinks as one area is probably one of the fastest growing. And what we see here in Cambodia is very typical of countries in this sort of transition phase in Africa, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia as well. Joanne, back to you.
Thank you, Evan. So in that case, what are we talking about? Why are we talking about taxation? We, I think, made a good case that tobacco, alcohol, and sugar-sweetened beverages consumption are bad for health, bad for the economy. But then why do we talk about taxes? In the next few slides, we'll try to explain to our best ability why taxation is one of the most cost-effective ways of improving health outcomes by reducing the consumption of these products. So let's first start by explaining that this is good economics. And let's do that by using a simple economic framework. So what we know is that these products have, we were still on the previous slide. Yes. In terms of the economic framework, the excise taxes on tobacco, alcohol, and sugar-sweetened beverages target consumption of these products, but also the way that the excise taxes are designed, they target the illness-causing element in these products. So in tobacco, it's the nicotine. In alcohol, it's the alcohol content. In sugar-sweetened beverages, it's the sugar content. And these products have negative externalities and negative internalities. Negative externality is a harm that accrues to non-users. So imagine drunk driving and all the dangers that it causes to other drivers, or smoking, the dangers or the negative health impact it causes to non-smokers who inhale secondhand smoke. But we also have this important concept called negative internalities, which are in economics uninternalized cost. One way to think about it is costs that accrue to the users of these products because they either do not understand the impacts, they have imperfect information, or they just do not calculate ahead of a long years ahead how this will impact their health. This is especially relevant for sugar-sweetened beverages because one can argue less about that causing a negative externality, which we'll explain better in the next slide. So in our economic framework, what the excise taxes on these products do is that it increases the price to better establish the internalized cost of these products, and therefore by higher prices, it's expected that the consumption of these products will decrease. So that brings us to the second component we see on this slide. When tax are introduced or increase, we see an increase in price, increase in price decreases consumption because we expect a change in behavior, a consumer behavior. So, for instance, some people will stop, some people will reduce, or we also, in many cases, higher prices will often help youth not initiating either alcohol or tobacco use. And in some cases, such as sugar-sweetened beverages, some countries, and Evan will talk about this in more detail, it may also induce a change in firm behavior. So, for instance, beverage companies reformulating products to put less sugar in it and making those products less unhealthy. Another component, last component, but very important, is these taxes also improve fiscal space in multiple ways. First, although there's decline in consumption, because often these products have inelastic demand or somewhat inelastic demand, the taxes generate additional tax revenue. But also, we talked about the health impact and the cost. And as countries get richer, that cost really increases. So once people quit or reduce, there is a significant improvement in terms of reducing government expenditures on the type of diseases that are caused by the consumption of these products. And last but not least, the households and individuals sort of welfare improves, because when you quit or when you reduce significantly, the individual's productivity increases, their human capital increases. There are also a lot of additional benefits to children in the households. Next slide, please. We talked about in the earlier slide negative externalities and negative internalities. I'm not going to harp on the externalities part. I think we gave some good examples. It's very relevant for tobacco and alcohol consumption, but it is a little less relevant for sugar-sweetened beverage consumption. So one can say, yes, obesity, the cost of that may create some additional costs and pressures on public health system or insurance system in the country. But for SSBs, really sugar-sweetened beverages, where really we talk about the negative part is the internalities. And that again comes from people having insufficient or imperfect information or present bias, and basically over-consuming these products in their life cycle. And once they get a certain behavior set in place, it's very difficult to change those tastes and behaviors. Next slide. And we hope that we made a case for why taxing these products makes sense. Then let's talk about what type of taxes, because there are multiple taxes that are put on these products: excise, VAT, import duties. But really, what is considered the health tax part is the excise tax part, because excise tax is the part that connects with and targets the negative externalities and internalities. A well-designed tax, excise tax, can generate strong demand impact, and in some cases, as we gave the sugar-sweetened beverages example, supply-side incentives. And also, excise taxes are rather easier to administer. Value-added tax is also imposed on those products, but the value-added tax is a very efficient revenue generator that is applied on a wide range of products. It doesn't differentiate between products. And often the best way to implement it is by having a unified rate, not a lot of different rates. So we often do not recommend VAT to be used to change behavior, but rather to raise revenue. And import duties are not health taxes either, because they doesn't necessarily target consumption. They rather target production and affect terms of trade. And the import duties are put in terms of where the product is produced rather than where the product is consumed. Therefore, it doesn't really change the price they do add to the price, but doesn't necessarily change the price in the way that we use excise taxes to change or influence behavior. I think next slide I'm handing over to Evan. Is that correct? No, I have one more slide. Okay, so health access to outcomes. This is just the recap of some of the things that we've discussed. Excise taxes, when they are well administered and well designed, they increase prices. Higher prices almost always lead to lower consumption by changing users' behavior and users' preferences. And that in turn improves health outcomes for individuals, but as a society as a whole. And the good news is tax revenue increases as well. And Evan, I think, will give you concrete examples of how that happens. So I'm going to stop here, hand over to Evan, and thank you for your attention. Over to you, Evan.
Thanks, Ceren. One of the key elements within the slide that's not really exposed here is the design of the taxes, because the critical factor here is that the design of the tax is going to impact how that tax change affects prices, both in the aggregate, but also even within the market. For example, if we use a specific tax, what we call a specific tax, which is the tax based on volume, it affects prices within the market in a different way to if we use an ad valorem tax, which is a tax based on the value of the product. And so that tax design is a crucial element to having this continuum here, this sort of step 1 to 2 to 3 to be effective. And what we've done a lot in our country work, where we work with our country economists around the world, is a lot of that time is spent focusing on understanding the design of those taxes, the types of taxes used, the way those taxes vary within the market, to understand how effective they are and to understand what reforms can make them more effective. So as a broad principle, and I say as a broad principle because for every principle you will find an exception. But as a broad principle, we prefer the use of what we call these specific taxes over ad valorem taxes. And the reason why we ultimately prefer them is because they lead to higher prices and higher prices across the market from a given tax increase. And that will then have a larger impact on consumption, a larger impact on improving health, and also because of the slightly easier administration of these specific taxes can also help us raise more revenue from it. There are other elements within this nexus between specific and ad valorem taxes where there's some nuance, but primarily that nuance is around the effect within the market. And partly where we see that is that specific taxes and increases of specific taxes increase prices of cheaper brands more than expensive brands in absolute terms. And that is what firstly causes a larger reduction in consumption, but it also limits the ability or limits the incentives for individuals to avoid that tax increase by substituting to a cheaper brand in response to it. And that's critically important for successful reforms. What we've seen as an example within tobacco or cigarette taxes, we've seen significant movement globally from away from ad valorem taxes to specific taxes over the last decade and a half. And at the same time, we see and hope to see more progress, for example, on alcohol in this case as well, and on sugar-sweetened beverages. In addition to specific and ad valorem taxes that's trying to break the world into two, there's actually a larger continuum, and we see many countries implementing both specific and ad valorem taxes, or what we might call a hybrid system, which is a system that has attributes of both within one. And even within those hybrid and mixed systems, we're seeing a movement towards mixed systems that have a greater reliance on the specific taxes. And that is really driving a lot of important positive impact at the country level. So let's show an example in action of specific taxes are on cigarettes in South Africa. I like to use this example because it's my home country, but in addition to that, I also like to use this example because it shows the full continuum of the policy impact from the well-designed tax, all the way through to health impact. And what we see in South Africa, the first picture in the middle at the top, is cigarette prices over a long period of time from 1960, which has been adjusted for inflation, and then is broken down into its different components. The excise tax, which is the specific tax, the VAT in the green, and everything else in the price in the blue. And what we saw is over a number of years, prices getting cheaper as taxes were declining. And as prices were getting cheaper and tax because of declining taxes, so cigarette sales were rising. And that occurred all the way through to 1991. And in 1991, we had a significant change in strategy where cigarette taxes were increased significantly year after year. And as the cigarette taxes increased, so did cigarette prices. And as prices increased, cigarette sales declined. And the price elasticity of demand, which is the relationship between prices and consumption, is clearly shown here. As the taxes increased, what we also saw is excise tax revenue from cigarettes increasing quite significantly. That is the red line in the second figure. And the reason why we saw tax revenue increase significantly is because the decline in sales was less than proportional to the increase in tax. So that's that price inelastic relationship that was mentioned earlier. However, what we've seen in the last few years is that tax revenue actually started to decline. And that's not because the tax instrument stopped working. It's because tax administration significantly weakened, and due to some governance challenges within the tax authorities, we saw the effectiveness of their ability to collect tax decline dramatically, causing a reduction in revenue. That said, this is something that we focus on a lot in our work, to work with countries to improve and enable a strong tax administration to primarily improve the effectiveness of the instrument. But then we can see the impact on smoking prevalence, and that's a strong indicator of health outcome. And what we see in the third image is the coincidence between cigarette sales declining and smoking prevalence. So what we see is that at the peak of consumption in 1991, smoking prevalence, adult smoking prevalence, was about 33%. And we've seen that consistently decline to around 20% in the most recent years. And so that's a dramatic reduction, a reduction about a third in smoking prevalence. And when we translate that into a measure of a health outcome, for example, using mortality and morbidity by measuring the DALYs per 100,000 people, we see that dramatic impact of DALYs per 100,000 people due to smoking in South Africa declining. But not only declining, we see how it declines much more rapidly than its peer group of countries in upper middle income countries, which really highlights that it did something different. And what it did different was increase the cigarette taxes very, very significantly, but importantly, a well-designed cigarette tax. When we then look at in more detail at the tax administration side, we can create estimates of the illicit trade in cigarettes. So that includes tax evasion and cigarette smuggling. And using these estimates, we can then estimate the number of cigarettes that are then evading taxes in South Africa. And what we can quite clearly see when we put that in a sales term is that it's really undermined continued progress, but it hasn't reversed those large gains made in the 1990s in terms of a reduction in cigarette sales. And this is really important to highlight that even when we have weak tax administration, it will undermine our revenue collection, it will undermine our progress, but it doesn't necessarily invalidate our instrument. And it really highlights the need to work simultaneously, both not just on the tax administration side, but even while trying to improve tax administration, to continue to focus on raising taxes and reducing consumption. Another example that I want to highlight is much closer in the region. And the examples from this point, I think, are going to focus more on the Asia Pacific region, because I think this might be more interesting for us today. The Philippines is actually a fantastic example, and it's one that's been spoken about widely within the region for nearly a decade now. And because what we've seen in the Philippines is not just the impact of reforms in terms of generating tax revenue, but just how rapid, dramatic reforms were implemented and a dramatically rapid impact on tax revenue. And this highlights one of the key features of health taxes is not just that it can generate revenue, but its ability to do that very quickly compared to some other areas of tax policy. In the Philippines, prior to this reform that began in 2012, and I say began because it's been ongoing ever since. In 2012, what the Philippines did was to take alcohol taxes and tobacco taxes, which previously were tiered specific taxes. And a tiered specific tax means that even though it was implemented as a specific tax, there were different rates of the tax for different prices of the product. So when we look at these categories, low, that means the low priced cigarettes had a lower tax rate than medium or higher price or premium cigarettes. And the same with beer, although that was with 3 categories. What the reform did in the Philippines was initially to consolidate the lower tax categories into the higher tax categories. And then once that uniformity had been achieved in 2017, to then start to raise taxes even further. And so on the cigarettes in the first year, they consolidated the medium and the high into the premium, and each subsequent year after that increased the taxes on the low priced until that uniformity was achieved. On beer, it was done in a little bit more of a concentrated manner. And the result of this is that when the effect on cigarette prices meant that the prices of cheaper cigarettes rose as quickly, or if not quicker, than more expensive cigarettes. And that ensured that consumers didn't simply quit smoking their expensive cigarette and replace it with a cheaper cigarette, but quit smoking altogether. And that meant a really large decline in per capita cigarette sales. So we've seen a more than halving of cigarette sales in the Philippines since 2012. And so that's a remarkably large magnitude. And when we look at the revenue side, we see similarly large magnitudes. And so the total tax revenue collected from tobacco and alcohol taxes has increased from about 0.5% to a peak of 1.6% in just before the COVID-19 pandemic. And not just that it increased, but the rapid pace of that increase. So in the first year alone, we saw a doubling of the fiscal space, or a near doubling of the fiscal space, from about 0.5% of GDP to 1% of GDP in 1 year. That sort of increase is incredible. Our friends at the IMF would call that macro critical because of its ability to significantly influence fiscal space, and to do that in 1 year is incredibly profound. I want to then highlight a country which has had a more challenging situation because of the challenge with the tax design. And Vietnam is a country that we've recently had a significant reform in. So I want to highlight that this is a historical view of Vietnam, because earlier this year, Vietnam adopted a major reform of excise taxes with a big focus on health taxes that will implement specific taxes and raise taxes over time. They begin to implement that in 2027. So this is not a critique of Vietnam; it's to highlight its history that has led them to this reform. But Vietnam had a typical ad valorem tax that was levied early in the supply chain, and that means that the tax itself is much smaller than it may sound. So the current tax on cigarettes is 70% of the ex-factory price, but that doesn't mean that's 70% of the final price. As we can see from this figure here, which decomposes the price into its different components, we can see that in actual fact, that 70% is about a third, or even less than a third, of the price of cigarettes, because that base that it's applied to is quite small. But what's noticeable is that when Vietnam increased that tax rate over time, originally from 55% to 65% in 2008, and subsequently to 70%, the effective tax in inflation-adjusted terms, so the actual value of the tax per pack, didn't increase. And the reason for that is the tax base was getting smaller over time. So firms were either undershifting the tax, or they were finding cost efficiencies, or consumers were simply trading down to cheaper brands. And so we didn't see any impact on price. Local brands remained relatively constant and even declined a little bit, while the prices of those Western brands increased. And the result of that is that we didn't really see any significant changes in cigarette sales over time. We saw some variations, but ultimately that red line is pretty flat. And then when we translate that into tax revenue, we see a similar picture where at times we've seen increases, but overall, it doesn't suggest a significant increase in tax revenue that we would have expected from the tax rate increasing by about a third. So it really shows how when using an ad valorem tax, and especially when early in the supply chain, that it doesn't really generate the impact that we seek, both on the health side through its impact on prices and sales, or through the fiscal side in terms of higher revenue. And just putting these side by side, these are the same figures really that we had in those previous slides of showing the Philippines and Vietnam side by side over a similar time period. And both countries raised taxes. But what we see in the Philippines, those taxes resulted in really high prices or increasing prices, which caused that reduction in sales and consumption. And in Vietnam, we really didn't see strong price effects. In actual fact, we saw the prices of the local brand of cigarettes get a little bit cheaper, and thus a minimal impact on sales. And so the reform in Vietnam, which was recently been adopted, will implement a specific tax and implement in addition to the ad valorem tax, and will increase that specific tax each year over a period of 5 years. And we'll come back to that hopefully in 5 years' time, and then be able to look at impact on prices and likely reduction in consumption. Now, I want to also point out Korea, because we are talking to an audience in Korea. I know it's probably an international audience as well, but certainly our audience should be interested in what Korea's been doing. And Korea's an excellent example of the impact of a very large tax increase. And I'm specifically referring to tobacco here. It also highlights some challenges, because we're looking at a period here in this figure on the top left of the price of a cigarette decomposed into the tax component. And Korea has a specific tax, which is a really good tax structure. But what we clearly see is a very large tax increase that occurred in early 2015. This figure's every 2 years, so it looks like from 2016, but it was implemented in January 2015. And that caused a very large and sudden increase in the price of cigarettes, and ultimately a very large shift in an existing secular trend, downward trend in cigarette consumption. This is the packs per person. And so we see that trending down over the long period of time. But around that tax increase, we see how that line shifts downwards quite a bit and then continues that secular trend. And really, this is a great example. In actual fact, I immediately sent it to another colleague because he was looking for an example like this for another country. And Korea is the fantastic example of the big price shock from a big tax increase. But the challenge is that it was a once-off tax increase. And this highlights a particular challenge when using specific taxes, which is that if we don't continue to increase taxes on a regular basis, that ultimately its value gets eroded by inflation over time. And this price of cigarettes, the tax of cigarettes that we see here is in inflation-adjusted terms. And because it's in that inflation-adjusted terms, we see that big shock and then that slow erosion over time. And we see that when we look at tax revenue as well. So the tax revenue, if we look at the bottom figure, and we look specifically around 2016, we see that orange bar jumps up as tobacco tax revenue increased following the increase in taxes. And then that orange bar is slowly being eroded over time. And when we look at tax revenue from both tobacco and alcohol in Korea, because alcohol generates a lot of tax revenue, when we look at that relative to GDP, it's eroding even quicker. And it's eroding even quicker because not just inflation is eroding it, but economic growth is making the denominator of the economy as a whole much bigger more quickly than the tobacco and alcohol tax revenue is rising. And while this might not present significant fiscal risk to Korea because it has a large developed tax base, in low and middle income countries, which might have narrower tax bases, smaller total tax revenue, that impact of that erosion in relative terms is probably a lot more significant than it might be in richer countries. We also have another interesting development in Korea, which is that just because taxes increased and a big tax increase, it doesn't mean that cigarettes in Korea have become a lot more expensive over time. And really, when we look at comparing Korea to its peer countries in the region, we see that cigarettes are still relatively cheap. And the reason for that is taxes are relatively low. So when we look across the region as a whole, as taxes increase country by country, we see the prices of cigarettes increase country by country. And really what we see with Korea is very much within the middle of the pack. And maybe even if we had to look at it by the high income countries or more developed countries in the region, we would see it's even significantly further behind. So that is a highlight of both the positive impact, but also some of the challenges that persist. Another interesting or more contemporary development is e-cigarettes, which we see becoming more popular globally. And particularly Korea is an interesting example of the heated tobacco products, which are the cigarette sticks that are not burnt but heated. The producers of these claim that they're significantly less harmful than cigarettes. We're not going to wade in on that. It's beyond our expertise as tax economists. But what we want to highlight is the implications around tax policy. And what we see in Korea, like many other countries, is these products are taxed less than cigarettes. And as they're taxed less than cigarettes, that either creates incentives for the firms to move consumers towards these products or incentives for consumers to move towards these products, whether that occurs demand or supply side. But what that has the potential to do is to slow down the decline in tax revenue, and that may have health implications. But it also reduces tax revenue because if they're shifting one for one from the higher tax to a lower tax product, it will over time reduce tax revenue. Our solution is pretty simple, is not to recommend that countries do or don't tax them the same, but even if they want to tax them at a lower rate, to ensure that consistently they are increasing the rates of both products over time, and thus still generating those incentives for substitution, but also still generating larger demand-sided incentives to reduce consumption of both over time. And that's really important. Not only will that have a bigger health impact, but it will also maintain and protect some of that revenue over time. I want to highlight another interesting country, but pivot to alcohol, because alcohol sometimes doesn't get the attention within the health tax space that it should. Partly, I think, because the political economy is a little bit more challenging. The health implications of alcohol use are more fragmented. So unlike tobacco, where all tobacco users are likely to suffer from at least whether or not they die of smoking-related diseases, they still going to suffer poorer health as a result. Whereas with alcohol, what we know is that a large proportion of the harm from alcohol is actually generated by a small proportion of the users. And that makes it relatively more difficult from a social perspective as well. But Mongolia is a very interesting country because it has a very high burden of disease due to alcohol use, and particularly from a very concentrated patterns of consumption of spirits, distilled spirits like vodka. And not only is it a very high burden, we've seen it actually increase over time, and really it's diverted away from the trend that we see in its peer countries. This figure is from a World Bank Public Finance Review, so we talk about the peers in different sorts of groups here. One is structural peers, which are countries with similar economic structures and aspirational peers, which are countries which they want to emulate in their economic development. And we can clearly see that divergence in terms of the disease burden. But at the same time, what we see is that taxes on spirits in Mongolia are not increasing. Certainly when we account for inflation in real terms, they're declining over time. And that at the same time is also resulting in a decline in tax revenues, well, certainly relative to GDP and as a percentage of total tax revenues. So even drinking more isn't getting them more tax revenue even. So it's the worst of both. And so within our public finance review, we tried to analyze their alcohol tax structure, their trends in a little bit more detail. So those follow-up slides were purely focusing on some of the intricacies of the supply side incentives, and they're very interesting, but they're not as important as this slide. And one of the reasons that I think Ceren wanted me to talk about this is the equity elements within health taxes are one of the most challenging parts that we have to sort of engage with when speaking to ministries of finance, because there is a concern that health taxes are regressive. The idea behind this is that because the poor, particularly in countries with high tobacco use, for example, smoke at higher rates than richer populations, that means that their average expenditure will represent a higher share of income. In addition to that, because poorer populations generally consume a higher proportion of their income to begin with, that means that consumption taxes generally and indirect taxes generally tend to be on average regressive. But this is not actually the important part for economists. Economists, we're very interested in the marginal effect, what a policy change is going to change behavior and what the change in regressivity or progressivity would be. And that's where we find some very interesting results from the empirical work on health taxes. Firstly, poorer groups or poorer portions of the population are more elastic, less inelastic, which means that for the same tax, they're going to change behavior more. And the reason being is because it is a higher proportion of their income to begin with. But secondly, and this is probably the more important factor, is that not only do health taxes change behavior and change the expenditure on tobacco or alcohol or sugar-sweetened beverages, it also is going to change, firstly, medical expenses, whether that is out-of-pocket costs or public spending. And by reducing, for example, tobacco use, we're going to see a reduction in the long run in the healthcare costs or the medical costs related to tobacco use. Secondly, it's also going to mean people are healthier and live longer, which means they can be more productive over longer periods of time. And that includes or results ultimately in higher labor incomes. And so when we take these together and we look at the impact of tax increases on this net income effect, and we account for the medical costs, the expenditure on the higher prices, and productivity costs or productivity gains, and we look at that across the income distribution, what we find is that overwhelmingly health taxes are progressive at the margin. So the policy change is progressive. And what we mean by that is the poorer the income decile, which we use as this measure here, we find that the increase in income in terms of the percentage point increase in income is larger, and thus they're seeing a larger relative benefit to their total income from the tax increase. This specific example comes from Indonesia and was focused particularly on Kretex, which is a unique cigarette that dominates the Indonesian market and even has a disproportionately higher consumption levels amongst the poor. And so we clearly see in Indonesia, as this example, we see this progressive impact. But we've got countless examples. This methodology we've done in nearly 20 countries, particularly on tobacco and sugar-sweetened beverages, and is a core component of the bank's work in this area to try and not just promote the health impact and revenue impact, but also improving equity at the same time.